An entirely new chapter in the Cold War opened in 1959. Personal diplomacy at the summit replaced conference table negotiating and conventional foreign office exchanges. Presidents and premiers, vice presidents and deputy premiers took the initiative, became traveling salesmen for their messages of peace or propaganda to both sides of the Iron Curtain, met face to face in a year-long series of visits. Whatever the real purpose of the missions, they gave East and West a closer look at each other, stirred some hope a thaw in the Cold War might really be possible. Soviet First Deputy Premier Anastas Mikoyan, second only to Khrushchev, set the pattern in January with this two-week visit to the United States. Traveled grassroots style from coast to coast, met many U.S. leaders. An almost certain move by Russia to pave the way for a Khrushchev visit. In February, British Prime Minister Macmillan went to Moscow, sought in this personal meeting with Premier Khrushchev a new approach to the Berlin issue, biggest cause of world tension since Khrushchev's ultimatum to the West last year. Another visitor to the U.S. from Russia, First Deputy Premier Frol Kozlov, who along with Mikoyan holds the second most powerful office in Russia. Main purpose of his visit to open the Soviet exhibit in New York. He toured the country, talking with ordinary Americans and top officials in all walks of life. Here's Soviet fair exhibits, stressing the great Russian advance in space. Other exhibits of art, fashion, cars, and television drew thousands of curious Americans. Kozlov talked peace and friendship, but on questions of hard policy, he talked like Khrushchev at his toughest. Repeated Soviet intentions to get the West out of Berlin. Kozlov's visit came during the Geneva meeting of the Big Four foreign ministers in July. A meeting typical of all post-war East-West negotiating. The subject, Berlin and the two Germanys, and fear Russia might turn over to East Germany the access route to West Berlin. The result, deadlock. Deadlock, too, in 1959 over disarmament as both sides developed new and deadlier weapons. Example, U.S. atomic submarines proved they could remain in polar waters year-round, able to fire the experimental Polaris missile from underwater within range of Russia. The rockets race gained momentum. Russia and the U.S. speeded efforts to perfect intercontinental ballistic missiles, which bring any point in the world within range. The deadlock in Geneva over such issues moved the ministers to private meetings at their villas. But the talks ended in stalemate. And Christian Herter, in his first major role as Secretary of State, went home and advised Eisenhower to invite Khrushchev to the U.S. Vice President Nixon carried to Moscow at the end of July instructions to suggest publicly the possibility of such a visit. Prepare the way for an exchange of visits by Khrushchev and Eisenhower. First business for Nixon, however, was opening the United States Fair, counterpart to the Soviet exhibit in New York. Like the Americans, the Russian people thronged to see exhibits of the way of life on the other side of the Iron Curtain. Better than any of the exhibits, however, a spontaneous show put on by Nixon and Khrushchev at the opening. They carried on a highly undiplomatic debate, astonishing reporters and spectators alike as they watched themselves at the television exhibit.
And will be carried at...
Neither took offense. Instead, seemed to enjoy the reaction they got. The serious part of Nixon's mission bore fruit. In early August, President Eisenhower called an unscheduled news conference, announced he and Khrushchev would exchange visits. Within 2 weeks, Eisenhower left for Europe to reassure the Allied leaders personally he would make no separate deals with Khrushchev. He also sought to smooth differences among the Allies. Main stops on his 9-day tour, West German capital of Bonn, and talks with Chancellor Adenauer. London, and a pleased Macmillan, who among the Allies was the strongest advocate of an Eisenhower-Khrushchev meeting and a Big Four summit conference. Finally, Paris and de Gaulle, biggest question mark among the Allies. But on the eve of Khrushchev's visit, Eisenhower won a show of Western unity. At midday, September 15th, a giant Russian airliner brought Nikita Khrushchev to the United States, and this historic meeting with Eisenhower that ranks as the top news story of 1959. The eyes of the world focused on the meeting between the arch rivals of the Cold War, leaders of the two greatest powers. Officials welcomed Khrushchev cordially. the American people in general showed curiosity, restrained politeness, skepticism at his repeated description of himself as a man of peace. The formal Washington visit over, Khrushchev relaxed on the train to New York, cracked jokes with newsmen, took a good look at the cities and countryside along the way. Packed 2 days in Manhattan, sightseeing, meeting business leaders and city officials. Then at the United Nations, he pulled all stops from his theme of peace with a sweeping proposal for a disarmament agreement among all nations to end all war. Here is the official translation.
The essence of our proposals is that over a period of 4 years, all states should effect complete disarmament and should no longer have any means of waging war.
The West in general considered the proposal so broad that it had little relation to reality, but conceded it contained great propaganda value. Later in the year, the United Nations voted to put the Khrushchev plan on the agenda. Next stop for the premiere, Los Angeles, and a Hollywood film studio where he watched a scene shot for the movie Can Can. Khrushchev, who showed Americans many faces and quick changes of mood, was reported to have taken offense at the dance, later unleashed a tirade at Los Angeles Mayor Polson, even threatened to go home. But he showed his humorous side in an exchange with the head of 20th Century Fox Films, Spiro Skouras.
Your country is the greatest corporation, the greatest capitalistic firm, the greatest monopoly the world has ever known.
A very good monopoly.
Хорошо.
Khrushchev countered in the same spirit.
Вы можете смеяться над этим.
He told the group that Russia is catching up to the United States economically, that pretty soon she's going to pass it by, wave, and say, "Now, catch us if you can."
Пожалуйста, за нами.
The Soviet leader went on to a 2-day visit in San Francisco, then to Iowa and the farm of Roswell Garst, who personally invited Khrushchev to visit him during a trip to Moscow. In these final days of his tour, Khrushchev's earthy and humorous qualities prevailed under relaxed security measures and improved atmosphere. Last stop on his tour, Pittsburgh, and a trip through a typical U.S. factory, where he continued to show his lively curiosity in every large and small detail of American life. Here, he had an exchange with a worker who suddenly presented him with a cigar. Khrushchev reached in his pocket and gave the man a watch. Behind him, overall, he left an impression of a man tough, wily, terrifically energetic, sensitive to criticism, as in the Los Angeles flare-up, a man of granite conviction, and a resourceful politician dedicated to the communist cause. Final phase of the visit, private talks on Berlin at Camp David, President Eisenhower's retreat in the Maryland mountains. Asked later for his impression of Khrushchev, Eisenhower described him as a dynamic and arresting personality. Of the talks, he told a news conference he and Khrushchev agreed to remove any time limit on settlement of the Berlin issue.
And over and above this, we agree, in addition to what the communique said, that these negotiations should not be prolonged indefinitely, but there could be no fixed time limit on them.
The agreement took the heat out of the immediate Berlin crisis, but the German question remained as far from solution as ever. Eisenhower postponed his visit to Russia, and in December set out on a tour of 11 nations in Europe, Asia, and Africa. His purpose? To convince the world that America wants peace and to gain the support of neutral nations in the Cold War struggle. He carried his message from Rome to Turkey, Pakistan, Afghanistan, India, Iran, Greece, Tunisia, France, Spain, Morocco. A 19-day trip taking him some 20,000 miles, an unprecedented trip for a U.S. president. An extraordinary venture in personal diplomacy that included the Western Summit Conference in Paris, looking toward a formal summit meeting with Russia next year.